Be aware of wonder were the first words in the reading. You may have forgotten that in amidst the hamsters and the white mice, but be aware of wonder. Because we live in a time of wonder. You may have noticed that yesterday if there were kids in your neighborhood making some sort of snow creature, a man or a woman or a yeti or a snow house or an igloo or a fort, having snowball fights and things like that. This is a time of wonder. So Reverend Fulgham tells us that he learned the importance of wonder in kindergarten. Not how to wonder, but that we are immersed in a world of wonder. Snow helps that. It takes us out of our routines and into our back sheds for that snow shovel that we forgot to bring out, or for sleds, or extra wood for the stove. I read those 4 words, be aware of wonder, this week, and my mind flashed back to a book that I'd read, or rather, a book that I had read to me perhaps 1,000,000 times, over and over, called A Time of Wonder. Any of you know that book? It's by Robert McCloskey and has beautiful paintings of Penobscot Bay in Maine. And it's the story of a family that lives on an island for the summer. Near the end of the book, there's a big storm that blows down many of the pine trees on the island. And I think some of you have been aware of pine trees being blown down recently, so maybe you can relate to this. But the main character, who seems to be a little girl but is referred to as you, wonders, where do hummingbirds go in a hurricane? Where do they go? And where do they go in winter? And what about the porpoises? And will those trees grow back? And 1,000 other questions that are never actually asked in the book, but you can tell that you are thinking about them. This week, I poked around the internet quite a bit, trying to find examples of wonder. One of the coolest was an astrophysicist who grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And he didn't really believe that stars existed as a kid, because if you look up in the sky and you're in Brooklyn, nah. But then he went on a trip to rural Pennsylvania, and he suddenly realized that the Milky Way was real. In fact, he said, it's just like the Hayden Planetarium. And another story was about deaf children in Nicaragua who were gathered together at some point because the dictator, whoever it was, decided that it would be good to do things for disadvantaged kids. So created a school, gathered all these deaf kids together, but didn't really know how to teach deaf kids. So they just took a regular teacher and said, here, you go teach those folks. And the kids themselves as a community created their own sign language because they didn't know. They created their own language just right from the ground. All the same age, thinking the same thoughts or whatever, just brought up this new language. And in that way they could communicate. And it was great because when they'd been isolated in their families with nobody else who was deaf, they just saw lips moving. They didn't know what was going on. And so with this language, they could express themselves and say what they're going to do and say where they were yesterday and things like that. But it wasn't until years later that somebody introduced signs that said, he thought, or he felt. And at that point, the community could imagine motivations in other people and feelings. Without the words, without the signs, the thought processes didn't work. The thought processes weren't there about feelings and thoughts. They for other people, just for themselves. So suddenly they were able to understand other people as being distinct from themselves, having their own opinions, having their own thoughts. What a cool revelation to be, I don't know, 14 years old and suddenly understand the concept that other people think. Wow. Well, anyway, if there's a Unitarian Universalist principle at the heart of this sermon, it is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It's the fourth principle that's listed in our congregation's covenant to affirm and promote. And it's in the gray hymnal, actually, right after the preface, if you want to read through all of them. And perhaps I'm also talking about acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. That's our third principle. And where do hummingbirds go in a hurricane? For many years, I thought, well, I imagined, I saw the world as if everyone thought or imagined or saw the world just like me. Clearly, as a teenager, I was the sort of person, I designed cities on paper that everyone could be happy in because I could be happy there. I thought about new languages that everyone could speak so that we could all talk together. And I was impressed by Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian house plan. That was a house that she called the first truly democratic expression of democracy in America. The house that everyone should live in, I thought. And I would go to MIT and solve the world's problems as an architect. I was absolutely sure of that. But the world, on the other hand, was not so certain. Once I was there, I started to see that the world was much bigger than Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a place where people were doing unimaginable architectural things. It was a place where people were smart enough to think astrophysical thoughts that I couldn't even understand the question they were solving. And I thought I was pretty good. But as they say, at MIT, half the students are below average. Since this is my story, I can make my life like a cassette deck and hit fast forward for a little bit to the summer before my junior year. I was in a cooperative program in the electrical engineering department, which was a department where my brain worked a whole lot better than architecture. And I'd come down to RCA's Central Research Laboratory in Princeton for a summer assignment. And they put me in a room with 3 old men. Well, when you're 20, just about anybody's an old man. They were Al, Dalton, and Walter. Now, one of them, Alfred Schroeder, was the guy who invented the color television picture tube, which was a pretty darn neat thing. It made RCA millions and millions of dollars. Everybody used color television picture tubes until the flat panel displays came in recently. And he was an interesting character. The second one was Dalton Pritchard, who had worked on the national standards body that defined how color television should be broadcast in the United States, the so-called NTSC standard. And then it lasted until the digital broadcasting standard took over just a few years ago. Some of you probably have NTSC televisions in your house. I have one in my living room. And you can't just put them out on the curb. You have to recycle them special with the township. Just thought you want to know that. Anyway, Walt Sepp, the third one of the Trinity here, was not so famous, but he also invented some things. He had some patents and stuff. Mostly he designed circuits that actually worked. Now, these are memories of 20 years ago. I was a college student, so they might not be perfect, but as I recall, the 3 men each had their own style. Al Schroeder had been raised a Quaker. He was an incredibly quiet and kind man. He rarely spoke. He'd sit and read. Sometimes, if you asked him a question, a day later he'd say, "I think I have an answer." I imagine that Al's talent at inventing things came from his religious practice of sitting quietly and listening. Not that the Holy Spirit invented color television, but there's a sense of quietude that leads to a form of innovative thought. Dalton Pritchard, on the other hand, he lived in the world of systems. He had block diagrams for everything and drawings of different ways to look at things and look at a problem, look at a signal, everything else. He could teach others in the company the value of a new idea, listen to feedback, improve proposals, and get them all implemented. He was a tennis player, ham radio operator, whatever. He loved to talk, loved to be with people. He was always jetting off to the product division in Indianapolis and stuff like that. And then there was Walt. Walt had the job of turning Dalton's blocks with random words in them into something that actually worked. He'd sit and ponder, and then he'd start reaching for resistors and transistors and capacitors, and he'd build odd little sculptures with these things and then plug in a signal there and a signal there. And if it worked, he'd put it in a box and then we'd use it for something or other. Make the picture sharper or more pleasing or reduce wear on other television parts. Walt's circuits were prototypes. They were then taken to the manufacturing division, which really did not like his construction techniques very much. They were redesigned to eliminate every expensive component and whatever else. Sometimes Walt's circuits didn't work. And that's when he taught me the secret of engineering. Everybody lean forward like this is really important. In those days, engineers could still smoke at their desks, and folks had pipes and cigars and stuff. But anyway, Walt had a special ashtray. He'd bring it out, he'd tear up bits of paper and pile them in the middle of the ashtray, and he'd make a strange and mystical incantation as he lit the little pieces of paper on fire, as if it was a gift to the gods of electronics. And then we'd go to lunch, and when we came back, sometimes the circuits would work. So, although I didn't have words for it at the time, I now see that these three men had remarkably different worldviews. And maybe you can compare them to the three fates of the Greek pantheon. One spun the web, the thread of life for each person, just as Al spun ideas. The second one measured length of life's thread, and then the third cuts the thread and chooses the time and manner of a person's death. Well, so Al was the creative one, and Dalton seemed to take an idea and thread it through management, and then Walt was left to execute the idea. Not to kill it, but to send it on its way to the product division, which might be the afterlife in some people's worldviews, or the scrap heap of ideas that just didn't work, which was not uncommon. In fact, there was a shelf that was full of little tiny boxes of ideas that its time never really came. It was kind of cool. It was there for decades. So they were sort of the fates of RCA Labs. Be aware of wonder. I tried this week to wonder about politics. But I'm not good at that. I'm not the sort of person who can wonder about it. I'll watch an election because it's going to change the way my life is for the future. But it doesn't connect to me that I have agency that there aren't people who are better at it than I am. So I don't wonder about politics. And then, as I leaf through my New York Times, I don't wonder about Broadway or the art world or opera, because I don't really understand those things. I mean, I like to listen to them, but I'm not in tune with where they're going as what is the future of Broadway? What is the future? I don't know. For many years, I wondered long and hard about television in the future because I got that. That was my thing. I could think about that and what products were going to be like 10 years from now and everything else. What would the internet do? What would happen to a society where local, like local news and local everything else, lost its meaning? How can a community thrive in a world of busy? Where would people turn to when they were frightened? And one day I noticed that I'd stopped thinking about circuits entirely and was thinking about people. My quest had changed. What do you wonder about? In the Gospel of Mark, we have a parable about watching seeds grow. First the blade, and then the ear of barley, and then the grains in the ear. The miracle of food growth. During the time of the Gospels, people knew that growth happened, but they didn't know why growth happened. And then in our responsive reading, Dick Fuchs, or Richard Fuchs as he goes by, lifts up our limitations and our dependence on wonder in this world, from the dawn to food to love and community. Things which come to us as gifts of being from sources beyond ourselves. It's a wonderful phrase and worth repeating. Things which come to us as gifts of being. As gifts of being from sources beyond ourselves. And so again we have Robert Fulghum. Be aware of wonder. Remember the little seed in the styrofoam cup? The roots go down and the plant goes up, and nobody really knows how or why, but we're all like that. And we are all really like that. Now, does that mean that we're all creatures of mystery, as in him saying nobody really knows why? Or does it mean that we're all spinners of our own lives? Do we instinctively spread our roots down, looking for nutrients? Do we grow up and show first the blade and then the ear? Do we instinctively reach for growth? When storms come, do we hide somewhere? Do we come back like the hummingbirds to continue our exploration? Do we instinctively wonder? Now, at age 5, kindergarten age, we're capable of wondering, capable of curiosity about our worlds, and able to ask, even though we don't yet have the capability of complex deductive thought. At age 5, we can see a seed sprout day by day and wonder what it's going to be. And at age 5, we're really good at asking. Parents, how many of you have you heard the one-word question, why? And maybe this is where theology comes in. For those of you who lived during the time of the Gospel of Mark, which I don't think is any of you, but let's pretend for the moment that we're living at that time, the world was full of God's actions. The earthquakes, the winds, the hurricanes, fires. There was no reason why. All of it was God's will. In fact, God made Africa and South America look like matching puzzle pieces until the theory of plate tectonics came along and made it obvious that this was why the two happened to fit together once. If it's for me, I'm not here. God made babies grow inside of women until we learned about reproductive biology. God, or the fates, gave people cancer, gave people diseases, took away the spirit or breath of a person. As wonders led to investigation, the world, day by day, discovery by discovery, made more sense. The collective we can cite that, well, it's ribonucleic acid reactions that happen in the laws of chemistry rather than the laws of God or fate that cause seeds to sprout. And God or fate finds new places for refuge. I wonder if perhaps that's why creationism is so popular. In the creationist world, God is still in command of lots of really big things. But choosing not to acknowledge knowledge is not the same as not knowing. The universe dances even if you refuse to leave your seat. The world of tomorrow grows from the seeds of today. It doesn't stand still. And it's still full of wonder. And we are all part of the process of unfolding tomorrow. But we're not in control, not singly. None of us is the Frank Lloyd Wright of the universe, designing the perfect house, the perfect democracy, the perfect world. No person can be that. Last week at Ed Zindell's memorial service, Karen asked me to use some lines from Gibran's The Prophet. And so I read through it, finding these words for today regarding children. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. And regarding children, their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. That's a theological statement for certain. And we can compare that with Richard Fuchs's all life, which comes to us as gifts from sources beyond ourselves, gifts of life and love and friendship. We lift our hearts in thanks this day. I wonder what you're doing today. I wonder what you're doing next week. Amen.